Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for choosing to come to this session on day 2 of our Connective Expo. For this morning's session, it will be divided into 2 sections. So this will be a showcase from the Žanis Lipke Memorial. So we have Ravis and Corey with us this morning. So Ravis holds a PhD in Museum Studies from the University of Leicester. Over the past 5 years at the Žanis Lipke Memorial, he has initiated and project managed the Lipke Bunker VR and Hannah's Story VR, the first in the series of Žanis Through Our Eyes, the multi-plot documentary for virtual reality, which you can see here. And he's joined by Corey, who is a creative technologist at Rise and Shine and Partners. His work has spanned new media, art, theatre and performance for the past 20 years. His work has received multiple local and national awards and has been featured in publications such as the New York Times and Fast Company. So I'll hand over to you guys, and we look forward to your showcase.
Thank you. So, welcome everyone. Here we are, Corey McLeod and myself. We are both of Latvian descent. Corey is based in Minneapolis, I'm in Riga. How come we got together? So the place I come from, Žanis Lipke Memorial, is a very peculiar one. It's been created by a bunch of creatives back in early 2000s, and since 2013 it's a fully fledged museum. And it is privately funded, and as I say, from the day one, we've been working with creative people, with artists, cutting edge in technology, also with scientists at the Riga Technical University, but always with the focus of trying to frame it as museums and creative industries. So a product is always something that speaks the language that the consumer or the user is speaking right now. So Corey has been with us for a good 5 years now, and that's the artist in residence concept. Although he's in Minneapolis, we are very close, and we are approaching the, let's say for the time being, preliminary opening at our site in Riga and in Berlin. In Berlin, why in Berlin, Corey will tell you more, but it's in-house production and for the house, for Riga and Berlin for the time being. And now I give it over to Corey.
Thank you. And I'm really grateful for the collaboration with Ravis and the Lipke Museum and their approach to interdisciplinary art creation. The support in that I require research support that I just don't have access to, or the skills and tools to build upon. And also thanks to everyone here for inviting us. This is you and Victoria, you've all been so great and kind and welcoming, and really appreciate it. And also want to give a shout out to my company, Rise and Shine. We're an advertising agency based in Linden Hills in Minneapolis. Linden Hills is a small part of Minneapolis, and we like to say we're the worldwide #1 agency in Linden Hills. And they have given me the time, the support, resources, equipment, and funding so I can do this work. And they do it out of a spirit of pure philanthropy. So just thank you to them for that work. So I'll move on to the project. I think I'll stand. I'm sitting way too much, so that's okay. So this project is about Žanis Lipke. We're calling it a multi-plot documentary made for virtual reality. And this isn't the first, kind of maybe just explain how Ravis and I found each other in a way. So about, this is me, that little boy with the teacher hovering over him. That's at my preschool Latvian school class in Toronto, Canada. So even my name doesn't sound very Latvian. I am of Latvian heritage. I grew up with my grandparents, and they taught me Latvian and sent me to these kinds of preschools where this woman is probably berating my grammar at that moment, and I'm bracing myself for maybe a slap on the head. But, you know, so being immersed in Latvian culture was important to me from a very early age. I mean, as a kid, we had to learn everything from how many milkable cows there were in Latvia in the 1930s to the arrival of Bishop Albert in, you know, the 13th century. But there was one episode of Latvian history that was always missing, and that was the history of the Holocaust in Latvia, which I only became aware of when I was well into my 40s. And I became aware of it through a spy novel, The Odessa Files, which is, you know, it's not historically accurate, and isn't meant to be. It's a spy novel, it's a thriller. But part of it takes place in the Riga ghetto, and it was like kind of like a shock. Wait, did this really happen? And then I started investigating, and then it must be about 15 years ago. I collaborated with the Riga Ghetto Museum on a website about. I collaborated on a website for the museum where we created using Google Street View. We kind of hacked Google Street View to create virtual tours where we geo-translocated your cell phone to a location in the Riga ghetto. So using Street View, you could go on a virtual tour. We used audio material from the USC Shoah Foundation. So when you got to a certain point in the ghetto, you would hear audio testimony that was relevant to that spot. So that was like the first project that I got into because of that. And because and the reason that story of the Holocaust was never taught to me as a child throughout this history is not just because of the participation and active collaboration and atrocities Latvians committed during the Holocaust and participated in or facilitated, but also this mentality of, well, we are victims of history. Therefore, we cannot be perpetrators. And in my opinion is we can't expect people to understand our suffering if we don't understand the suffering we have inflicted upon others. I don't feel a responsibility for the crimes my grandparents may have facilitated or contributed to, but I do feel a responsibility to those stories and how those get put out into the world. And educating future Latvians on, you know, the crimes that were perpetrated on our fellow citizens. So another sort of side story, when I started working on the Riga Ghetto project and I put that out into the world, I was fully expecting to get pushback from the Latvian community. And my wife and I were both bracing ourselves to receive pushback and have people call us all sorts of names. What happened was an outpouring of love. It was, and I'm not exaggerating, people telling me stories of how their parents would help, you know, how one people told me her father was an art school teacher and a lot of his students were in the ghetto, and how he brought food to them in the ghetto. And she never told anyone this. She was afraid to tell people that story. And she felt she felt empowered to tell that story. And people who said, I get our community. I get why there are so many problems with alcoholism, substance abuse. We're dealing with traumatized people who, and I mentioned this to Rabbi Butkans, who was the director, or is the director of the Ghetto Museum, and he said to me, yeah, it's because the Holocaust is a scar on Latvia that has never been allowed to heal. And, you know, I hope I'm doing my part in helping to heal that one together with the Žanis and the Lipke Museum. So, about our project, Žanis Lipke was a dock worker. He had no money, he had no power, he had no influence. But this simple dock worker from Riga was able to help up to 55 people escape from the Riga ghetto and the Kaiserwald concentration camp. Each of those operations was its own unique escape plan. And he did this through ingenious means. Not only that, he built bunkers, one even under, like right by his house, and in the countryside where he kept these people safe, hidden, and fed for the duration of the Holocaust. Žanis can go into great detail about the networks of people he enlisted, but truly an act of incredible heroism of what he accomplished. Most of the people were complete strangers. Some of them were people he knew before the Holocaust, some were friends, others complete strangers. And so the story of Žanis Lipke, why we call this a multi-plot documentary for virtual reality, is this isn't a singular story. This is the story of many people. It's like a collection, and this is how we know the story, or how I was introduced to the story of Žanis Lipke, was through a man called David Zilberman, who started collecting testimonies of Žanis Lipke, and then later published these stories in a collection called Like a Star in the Darkness. So I'm looking at Žanis, wait, have I got the title right? And it's through these individual testimonies, and there are very differing storytelling quality. Some of them are extremely well written and embellished. Some of them are very short and factual, but they're all fascinating, all for their own terms, all on their own terms. And so the idea is, when we started collaborating and thinking about how we tell this story, the concept I came up with is, instead of telling the story through Žanis's perspective, let's tell it through the perspective of the people he rescued. And when you tell the story through the perspective, when you see Žanis's story through the perspective of the people he rescued, you see the heroism that it takes to survive, right? You see the heroism to say, I will put my fate in your hands, you complete stranger, and trust you. And that the will to survive is, I know this path I'm going on might bring me certain death, might bring me death, but I will trust you and put my faith in you, which is an act of extreme heroism. And you see that kind of filters through, comes through in the stories. Anyways, so the idea of the story is that when you view our experience, there are you're in a forest clearing and you see a number of doors, and when you look, each of the doors represents one of the stories, and you can choose which door to go through, and you're propelled into that story. So as Žanis mentioned, we've been working on this for 5 years. 5 years later, we kind of have one of the stories complete that you can go see in Silverstone. Come visit me. I know it's a bit of a trek to Silverstone in Arts Building A, I think. But do come. I'd love to show it to you. And it's the story of Hanna Stern. So Hanna Stern was 6.5 years old when her and her mother and brother Jacob were deported from Berlin to Riga. Hanna's brother Jacob perished during the liquidation of the Riga ghetto, or shortly before that. And Hanna, during the liquidation of the Riga ghetto, Sophie and Hanna hid in a basement. After the liquidation, they emerged and were then transferred to the Kaiserwald concentration camp, whilst at the Kaiserwald concentration camp, Sophie made contact with Žanis. He staged an incredibly, hi there guys, an incredibly elaborate escape plan to get them out of the concentration camp. And just the logistics of it are mind-boggling of how he was able to accomplish that. And once he busted them out of the Kaiserwald concentration camp, he kept them safe in a bunker in the countryside of Latvia until the end of the Holocaust. After the Holocaust, there was a period where Hanna and Sophie had to wait in Latvia until their transit visas to emigrate to Israel were taken care of. And then in the 1950s, they were able to emigrate to Israel. And Hanna's story is not in the David Silberman collection. It is, Žanis Lipke gave a testimony to in the tribunal of a Latvian who was convicted of war crimes Arais. Am I correct in that? In the Arais? So Viktors Arais, a notorious Latvian war criminal. And in that testimony, Žanis gives a 2-paragraph description of the rescue operation. That's how I thought this is an interesting story that we should start with. And I kind of knew the vague outlines of it. So I got in touch with Hanna's daughter. Hanna passed away in the 1990s, but I got in touch with Hanna's daughter, Ilana, who lives in Israel, and asked her, hey, can you tell me your mother's story? And she said, well, unfortunately, I don't know my mother's story. My mother aggressively did not talk about it. She said, like on Yom Shoah, her mother would unplug the TV, unplug the radio, close the curtains, did not want to talk about it in any shape or form. And she said she only found out about it when the book was published. Like she found out about it like the rest of the world. But she said, I do have a letter my grandmother wrote to the German war claims office, to actually the lawyer representing her case. And she said, but there's just one problem, it's written in German. And I said, no, that's fine, I'm an excellent German translator. Not excellent, I'm good, I'm okay. And then she said, well, there's, the other problem with the letter is that it's written on like airmail, that old airmail paper that's very thin, and it was written double-sided. So the ink seeped through on both sides. So much of the pages weren't legible. And I was like, okay, that's a bigger problem. But fortunately, I have a friend who's, he's a specialist in computer vision and works in the medical industry. And I gave him a call and I said, here's the problem I have, do you know a solution? And he said, oh yeah, Edwin Jacobs wrote an excellent paper on this a few years ago. I'm like, dude, just tell me what to do. So he kind of walked through a very simple process of how to scan everything, settings I have to apply in Photoshop, and boom, the letters kind of like magically appeared out of the paper, which was wonderful. And then because it was handwritten, this is like a short excerpt from the letter, because it was handwritten, I had to like type it out first, and then I translated it. It was a magical feeling. It was like this woman whispering this story into my ear. And when people ask me, oh, did you write the script for this story? I say no. It was gifted to me. It was channeled, if we want to use more esoteric terms for it. And then it was like, so I wrote the narration, and we needed someone to read it. And I asked Hannah's daughter, Alana, will you read it? And she said yes, and she's so great, because she has this sort of dark, very imposing voice like this. And it's just like the whole VR experience is kind of built around the tone of her voice and the tone of that story, and created out of that. So, you know, I'll just kind of go through a few of the things things we did in the story, you know, kind of like how I created it. I'll go back to this first slide here. So this is how the experience starts. So you put on the headset, you're in a forest. I know everything's very dark. Everything comes out very dark because in virtual reality, it's its own lighting field. So these are screenshots from virtual reality that come out way darker in real life than when you see them in virtual reality headsets. But it's basically, here you can kind of see an outline of a door, right? And I'll show you this door a bit later as well. Wow, they're even darker on the screen. And then here you see, this is the door to Hannah's story on Veteranenstraße in Berlin. So when you look at it, all the interaction, like one of the challenges we constantly face is when you do virtual reality. Here, put on this thing put this computer on your face, and now take these controllers, and if you want to do this, press this button. If you want to do this. And then people, you know, when you're showing it to old people, they go, oh God, I can't even operate my phone, and now you want me to do this thing with the controllers. But so everything is activated. I've set up like visual triggers within the experience. So certain things, actions are triggered by looking at certain things. So here you go into this, you're in this forest space, you hear this Brian Eno-like ambient music that a composer in New York created for me, which is really harrowing and awesome. But you hear forest sounds, and there are these doors. And these doors are modeled after actual doors of residencies where people lived, right? So this door here is the door to Itzhak Drezin's story. And, you know, in his testimony to the USC Shoah Foundation, he says, I lived on Rubniatsiv Street. And so I went to Rubniatsiv Street, and the door's still there. It's the exact same door as was there in the 1930s. So I was able to create a photo scan of that and make a 3D model out of it. On Veteranenstraße, so that house isn't there anymore. So that was created out of, you know, taken from archival photos and something that was kind of similar to the doors in that neighborhood. So, and when you look at that door at a certain trigger point, then that door opens up and you're propelled into the story. So it triggers certain things that trigger actions, camera movements going through. So maybe I shouldn't stand there, because then I have to. And the other thing, one of the other early choices or challenges I realized was how to portray people in virtual reality. So the project I'd done before this one was also a Latvian-based project, which was about a Latvian rock band called Pakoins that was really instrumental. Like, I kind of make the argument, like, it kind of helped bring down the Soviet Union. I mean, it's a stretch, but you can't say they brought down the Soviet Union, but you can make a case. And the idea was Gorbachev said the fall of the Soviet Union started in the Baltic states. In another interview, he said it started in Ukraine. In another interview, he said, but let's just go with the Baltic states one. And this rock band was really instrumental in creating the soundtrack of this period in Latvian history, which we call Second Awakening, in which led the independence movement in the 1980s. Anyhow, that entire piece was, that band had a lot of great archival photos, and it was through those photos that I was able to build a virtual reality piece around. Example of that is that they had this one concert in a place in a city called Uagra, and it was a big concert, but most of the concert goers had come there from Riga, which is about, what, 50 kilometers? Uagra is 50 kilometers from Riga. So short train ride, right? From Riga. So they come to the concert, and on the way back from the concert, a few of the teenagers who are at the concert were so hyped up that they demolished the train. And not even, I think the total damage to the train was something like 5,000. It was only monetary damage. A few benches were torn up, you know, just a few windows broken. But basically, you know, vandalism on a small degree. The Soviet regime came down viciously hard on these kids. And so Path Ones was not just, the band wasn't just banned, they were forbidden from working. And anyways, as long story short, this film, the trial of these was documented, it became a really big deal, and this concert's very significant. That band, there was a photographer who took photos of that entire concert I had 400 photos from that concert, and was able to cut out the photos and recreate that concert based on these photos of where audience members were. And people who were at that concert were able to say, I was there, that's me, right there, and see where they were standing. And the reason I go on this incredibly long tangent is, how do you show humans in virtual reality? And if you use something like 3D modeling, 3D models, I mean, all of you have seen like Fortnite and Call of Duty that are like the high end of live action 3D character modeling. It still looks weird. It still looks uncanny. And I was like, okay, the guy who founded Oculus calls it the valley of the uncanny, that it looks real, it looks almost photoreal, but there's a level of, there's that one level of fakeness that makes it just feel creepy in a not good way. So I realized 3D models to show characters isn't the way to go. So the solution, I thought, was to just do everything as hand-drawn drawings. And so all of these characters, anytime you see a human in the VR project, they're all hand-drawn, which is why it took 5 years. And then using very basic animation techniques of, you know, cutting all the instances up, creating puppets, animating them, and then taking those animations into a gaming engine like Unity, and I created just really simple software to every time that tracks the user's eye movements. So if this is the plane of the this is you and like your camera being your eyes, and you move it like this, then the sprite moves like this. So it's always facing the camera, so that 2D-ness comes through. And what I find interesting about that technique, that through that alienation technique, and when you're in virtual reality, you see the 2D-ness of those characters in relation to the 3D objects. They feel 2D, but it almost makes it more real than if I had tried to do traditional gaming 3D modeling technology. That alienation kind of brings it out. And I think that the other thing is just that what I find through hand drawing, and most of the drawings are based on archival photos, just going through collections and finding people during that period. And sometimes from Riga, sometimes from other places, from other sites, but there's a level of empathy that just gets poured in when you look at someone with your hands as opposed to just your eyes, and they start to speak to you. Like they start to not speak to you, but reveal themselves to you. You start to see characteristics. And even if those photos are very grainy, and I guess that's when the imagination kicks in and you start filling in those gaps. And I think it's just that investment of time that I think a viewer also picks up on and sees and takes in. So that's the one thing of doing everything as the character drawings as hand drawn, and but a lot of the architecture in places is created as 3D elements. For example, right here, you don't see it because it's a bit cut off, but this is a model of the Lewitzowstrasse synagogue in Berlin, which was the Sammelstation that was used in Berlin as the gathering point for the deportations to the Riga ghetto. And I was able to create this 3D model from one postcard of the synagogue using a technique called perspective mapping. So what perspective mapping does is you bring in a photo into a 3D modeling program. It then analyzes basically where the camera is in relation to that object, and kind of says, okay, this is the kind of lens that was used on that camera, this is where it was located in space. And through doing that, you can just start using that as the building blocks to build a 3D model and assemble everything together. And you'll see a few other examples of that. Does anyone have any questions yet? Are we good? All right. Am I going too fast? Am I just slow? Okay.
We've got about 25 minutes just for time, and we can do Q&A at the end if you want.
Okay. I will. Oh my gosh! I'm just looking at the time. All right. I'll start racing. Wait, how much time do we want for Q&A?
However much you want.
Okay. I'm just looking at the time and realizing that I've talked way too much.
Sorry, this is in the Silverstone building.
This is in the Silverstone building. Please come watch it.
So is this Hannah's story, right?
This is Hannah's story, yeah.
Okay.
So it's like...
Yeah, I have 2 attempts to try.
Oh,
so
no.
Today
we'll make it happen. I will stay there as long as it takes. I am not leaving Silverstone until everyone who wants to see it will see it. Because, another example, just the hand-drawn drawings, it's like, if I had to, so this is the scene, so when they busted them out, when Žanis busted Hannah out of the ghetto, Hannah collapsed and just couldn't go any further. I mean, I've simplified the story to a heartbreaking degree. But the gist of the story is Žanis lifted her up and put her on his shoulders and carried her It's the full version is even more beautiful and harrowing. But you know, when I created this as an animation, it's like it took me 3 months, but I'm happy for every minute I spent on it because she feels like this doll that's just like weightless, and the way he picks her up, and you get to control that, and you get to experience it. If you had to do that as a film shoot, that would be, even just that scene would be, you know, tens of thousands of dollars for the crew and stuff. And for me, it's just time, you know, and we can do that. We can, using these kinds of technologies, we can really reach into the past and show our perspective and how we see this past, and put our own unique signature on it and say, this is our signature, but if you want to do it, you put your signature on it, you know? And this is another example of, you know, the hand-drawn drawings, and you can't really see it here because it's so dark, but these are all buildings from, this is the part where you're traveling through the Riga ghetto, and when you look around, there are these mini snippets of stories. So you see someone there on the right playing the accordion. The inspiration from that was from Gertrude Schneiderman's memoirs about the Holocaust, and she has one chapter dedicated to music in the Riga ghetto, that you know, you could always hear music. People were always trying to play music and keep themselves entertained in that way. So I put that in there. Further, when you look to the right, you can see the gallows of the Riga ghetto. That was also like recreated from an archival photo of the ghetto, and the inspiration. The one drawing I still want to add to that is boys playing soccer there, and that comes from a testimony where a man says, yes, we used to play soccer by the gallows because it was the only space in the ghetto that was open enough to kick a ball in, right? Which just seems harrowing, and you know, giving people an idea of that proximity, constant proximity of violence. And so you go through the ghetto, and all of the buildings are I 3D modeled from, you can kind of see this here through a technique I kind of like didn't invent, but kept working on and kind of trying to suit my own creative production needs, is just walking through Riga constantly. Every trip I went, taking photos and using those photos as very low-tech 3D scans. And the way objects work, 3D modeled objects work in a 3D environment, is that they have several layers. The first layer being, you know, the layer color graphic designers work with is color. So this is, you know, the photo that you would usually see. But then using various techniques, you can create what's called a normal map. Some people call it a bump map, which kind of reads the depth and textures, so the little micro divots of something so all of those, this tells the light source, bounce off of this object like this, put a bit of shadow here. And this map is called the metallic smoothness map, which is about how much light gets reflected off this part. So the white areas you see, like right here, more light gets bounced off of that than other areas. And through that, just by walking around the Riga ghetto, and the Riga ghetto largely, most of those buildings from the days of the Riga ghetto are still there. So you can go through and just take photos and create, you know, something that is, like this street does not exist in the Riga ghetto, but all of those buildings are from that territory. So It's like creating something that's a semblance of the Riga ghetto and that territory, which feels like, just stuff piled upon, someone coming from America, it feels like that, just buildings piled on top of each other in a very organic form. And also another, this is, you can't see it, it's so dark here, but this is from the Kaiserwald. No, it's not the lights. I think it's the monitor in the photo. So this is mine. I should have lightened up the photos before I brought them in. So it's my fault, nothing. These are the Kaiserwald barracks, which I was able to, using the same technique of perspective mapping, was able, from one photo, I was able to kind of like reconstruct where all the posts were, where the beds were, how big the beds were. And as a side anecdote, with the sort of bunk beds, then when I was at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, they have a bunk bed from Auschwitz on display. And me being a geek, I took out my AR measurement tool and started measuring the bunk bed. And the measurements of the bunk bed that's on display in Washington and what I created in 3D model, I was off only by a few centimeters using this tool, which is it's just fascinating. Like, I didn't write the software, so I can't take credit for it, but how accurate and how much through one simple photo, we can really reach into the past and create something for future generations. Okay, why virtual reality? Or why not just make a simple documentary film with all the problems? This is a photo from the Harvard visualization lab, which I love. And this is all the headsets they've worked on over the years. And what I realized when I was there, it's like, we all say, oh, virtual reality is such a new medium. No, it's not. He always says, when Russ, who runs the lab, says, oh, virtual reality is in its infancy, he goes, look, I've been working on this stuff for 20 years. And the people who taught me have been working on it for 20 years. So don't tell me it's in its infancy. And they've constantly had to deal with these problems of technology, of resolution, of how you solve certain problems. And whenever they've found creative solutions, they've tried to meet the technology of where it's at and not where they want it to be, right? And and it's a creative process to find that, work with the limitations you have at that moment as opposed to what you'd like it to be. And also the inspiration for this was my son Christoph's, whose birthday it is today. When he first saw my piece, he not even saw it, he just looked at my screen. And I was like, well, what do you think of that? And he goes, looks like an indie game. And I had this flash, this revelatory flash at that moment that, most of the people were all roughly the same age, and I assume we all played video games, and we were content with, shooting asteroids from a triangle and Galaga and Pac-Man. We just played what they gave us. Kids, millennials, Gen Zers today, their gaming knowledge and tastes are way more sophisticated, are way more connoisseur-like. They seek out art and uniqueness in games. They seek out immersion. One of the most popular games in the last few years is a game called Cupheads. And I know this through having a teenage kid. That was all, and Cupheads was all hand-drawn. And that's what made it so appealing. They seek out games that have different kinds of immersion. They study retro games like putting simulators on that will simulate an Atari card from the 1980s is a thing, right? So that's kind of been my guiding light. Okay, I want to create an immersive experience for these, gaming connoisseurs, and speak in an artistic language that appeals to them, and hopefully through those means being able to reach them in a new way. As opposed to, it's not just the medium that attracts them. It's not enough to just say, oh, I made a VR piece or a game. It's the artistry has to be there, the craft has to be there, in my opinion. Which is why, I always make this appeal for this collaboration with people like me, and the collaboration we have going through people immersed in academia and people immersed in digital creative production. So where are we going to put this? How are we going to put this in the world? So right now at the Žanis Lipke Museum, we are working on creating this installation. These are the few rough drawings I made just to give people an idea of what this is going to look like. But basically, it's projected onto a wall. Whatever the viewer is seeing is projected onto a wall. And so we can see what the viewer who currently has the headset on is seeing. This is also an immersive sound experience. So to recreate the immersive sound experience, we're currently working with an awesome audio engineer to create a 3D sound installation, so people in the space who are waiting to do it or just watching along can experience the immersive 360 sound. Because the way it works is if the accordion is here and you hear someone playing accordion, it feels like they're over here. And we have also triggers in place, so you hear someone calling, come here, motivate you to look in that direction. So we're going to have all that. And this is also based on the insight that watching someone in gameplay is almost just as entertaining as playing the game yourself. Like, there are millions of hours of people playing video games. There's an entire Twitch is all based on the enjoyment of watching other people play video games, which I'm like, yeah, I remember that. Standing by the Pac-Man machine, watching someone else play Pac-Man. That's what this is kind of based on. And creating, a unique experience that people will want to seek out, as opposed to something that's replicatable. And since I'm running out of time, I will not check off my Walter Benjamin quote on my media conference bingo card.
10 minutes if that's useful.
Okay. And then one thing, so that's the one way we want to put this out into the world. And then the other way we want to put this out into the world is just basically traveling shows. So creating mobile kits that we can go out into the world and give people a high quality, a unique experience that can be brought to schools, higher learning centers. So when I talked a bit too long about my previous project, but we took this to film festivals. We even had a concert where the band played and we had 20 headsets, which was it was a crazy experience doing VR at a rock concert. Art galleries, we did live TV shows, we even did the airport presentations, schools, church basements, festivals in Paris. You can go anywhere with this and create a unique experience for people. And then Žanis is working on the educational packet that, you know, we train a couple of young people to go out into the world to bring this to the communities that want to hear this story and learn about it and give them the framework with which to talk about it. And yeah, that's what I got. So I should have written thank you here, but thank you. We can go to the Q&A now for either myself or Žanis.
Oh, great.
Who's
Yeah, very interesting talk. I'm wondering, is it possible to use real actors to do reenactment rather than animated characters? Is there any challenges in terms of technology?
So, oh my God, like a question for my dreams. So yes, there is something called volumetric capture, and it kind of was a thing a few years ago, and the way volumetric capture, no, it wasn't a thing 3 years ago. It's like people have been developing it, but the development of volumetric capture hasn't been as fast as the development of other technologies. And basically the way volumetric capture works is I've used it with, do you remember the Kinect when that came out, Microsoft Kinect? It was about 15 years ago it came out. So basically this is a depth sensor which takes a photo every frame of what I showed you before with that color map. It takes a depth photo too, so it uses, you know, kind of like sonar-like technology. So with every pixel, it estimates how far it is from the camera and then can create a depth map of that. And so you're watching basically a video that has, you know, the color image and then a depth map underlaid on top of that, which gives it that three-dimensionality of it. And then there's an alpha map on top of it. The problem with that technology is that you imagine just to have a 3D model that's a flat surface, it's like every frame you have to do X million amount of calculations per frame. Now, you take that depth map with all of that, you're multiplying that amount of calculations by 5. So instead of 1 million calculations per frame, you're asking the computer to do 5 million calculations per frame, which creates an incredible strain on the computer, which means that it can't render as fast, which means, so it's like, it's not a problem of, does the technology exist for that? The problem is, do you have a computer that's powerful enough to do that? And there are computers, you can buy, you know, a supercomputer for $20,000 and it'll run fine. But I mean, that's always the issue is, do we have the computing power? And I think the computers, like, I mean, once quantum computers come around, then we can say absolutely. You have a question, I saw. Do you have a question?
I did have one. I was wondering about the narrative structure, because you were talking about certain types of interactions, and I'm wondering how did you approach either, I don't know, are there some branches in the narrative or?
So great question, thank you. So the way I approached that was that there are points in the story that if you want to look around, that are natural looking around points, that the narrative basically pauses and you can look around and it only continues when you look at that further side. I kind of explored like alternative, the only sort of like choose your own adventure part would be at the beginning. I kind of started exploring that, but I'm like, no, I want to tell this story, but I want to give those pauses so people can look around. The one thing I tried to do was, for instance, when you're going through the Riga ghetto, and there are all these mini stories that are happening, I wrote a small micro program that basically the camera movement slows down when you look to the side, and when you look back, it goes at a normal rate. The processing power that asked of the computer, because it's like calculating where the computer is in relation to that, it just kind of like everything started to stagger too much. And even though I really wanted to keep it because I thought as a narrative tool that code was really important, it was just my computer just couldn't keep up with it, and stuff was stuttering, which just created an unoptimal user experience. So there was also one of those things where, you know, the story takes precedence over technology. You know. Yeah.
I'm curious to know, because this project, you explained it's a lot about technology, but it's also almost seems like an artistic endeavor.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was for a purpose. It was a museum that had goals, objectives with hiring you. How did this interaction went during those 5 years? How did you manage to stay on speaking terms with each other? There were means, financial means.
Yeah, well, do you want to talk about that?
We, in parallel to this project, we already are running a VR room, which is a Lipke bunker room. Corey was kind of invited to do the second iteration of that VR thing, but his personality, you see, he wanted to do his own. And so we ventured in this new direction, which is a new story in a multi-plot documentary, which we hope to continue. And myself, at the memorial, I'm working on an infrastructure for this piece to be part of our educational programming.
That's right.
That thing, the first thing is ready integrated. This is about to be launched in September. We are opening second week of September. And the third week of September, if I might announce, on the 24th of September in Berlin, in a similar room, in a Silent Heroes Memorial, which looks at all rescuers in European countries. So this is for purpose to be run at the sites for the school groups. That's why this out of the headset setting that we are working on now.
Right.
And a mobile version for traveling the world. But not for the cloud. We started thinking like Anna Frank House, oh, we'll put it in the cloud, everyone will watch it. No, it's policy restricted. We need people to go to our school place and bring it.
Yeah,
Okay?
yeah.
Okay, we probably have time for one more.
I'll go. I'm just curious, just following on from that, because obviously it has been going for 5 years, which is quite a long time.
Well, it's also my spare time. That's,
Okay.
you know.
And so I was just curious because you mentioned I'm kind of curious about the costs involved in doing something like this, is where my question's kind of leading, because for that time period, even if it's part-time, it's still quite a long time to fund that. So I'm just wondering, you mentioned that you had to do things in certain ways to reduce costs, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, I don't think I had to do things in a certain way because of technological limitations. And, you know, even with $1 million, I wouldn't have been able to resolve those issues just because the computing power still doesn't exist. It will exist in the future, but it doesn't exist now. And so I'm fortunate that, you know, I work at an ad agency that, you know, wants me to do these kinds of projects, and when I have free time, I can work on it. So it's a luxury I'm very grateful for, and gives me the chance to put my skills to use in doing good. But the one thing, when I say 5 years, I started showing this project at festivals after 1 year. And it was like each time I showed it, I would learn something new and even after this festival and watching people do it, there's this constant, like the next goal isn't 5 years away, the next goal is 6 weeks away when I'm showing this again. And then I learn things through watching people interact with it. Like when people do it, I don't ask them what they think. I know what they think because I'm seeing what they're seeing. I'm seeing how they're interacting with it. I'm seeing the modifications I have to make, which is the wonderful thing about this technology. And so that's kind of like how I've been able to motivate myself over those 5 years of doing it. And seriously, the biggest cost is just time. I mean, doing this kind of stuff, if you've got a computer like if you want to go into this field, you gotta get, you basically need a PC that's fairly decent, with a good graphics card. Unity beginner's license costs $0. Blender costs $0, which is where I did all to do sound mixing. FMod has also a free user license you can use. I mean, all of that stuff is accessible to you for very little cost. A good headset ranges, you can start with, the Oculus for $500 up until the high-end ones, which are $1,300, but for very little cost, you can start doing this and reaching into the past to do it.
And may just add that with a little help of funding that I, as a project manager, attracted the project, will bring it to the stage of final product and can really launch it at the sites that we work on.
Yeah.
Okay, but thanks to Corey, his pro bono work on this project.
Okay, well, thank you very much both for
Thanks for coming. Come watch